Go ahead and get started. Does that sound too loud? Yeah, that sound all right? Okay. All right. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, just want to thank you so much for allowing us to be here tonight, and just want to acknowledge you as the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and just thank you for how much you love us. We thank you for your mercy and your grace. We thank you for Jesus and his willingness to leave his home in heaven to come to this earth to live as a man, to give up his privileges of heaven, and to submit to your will, and to die on the cross for our sins. And we're so thankful for the home in heaven that we have to look forward to one day. I pray that you'll be with us tonight as we study chapter 8, and just pray that you'll be with me as I teach. Give me wisdom, and may the words that I say be in accordance with your will. And I pray that you'll be with those who aren't here tonight, especially be with Mignon and Grady and Krista and Daniel and their kids, and as they're in Honduras, just pray that you'll keep them safe while they're on their mission trip, and just bring them back to us safely next week. Again, we just love you so much, and thank you for all that you do for us. In Christ's name, amen. All right, so tonight we're moving on into chapter 8, which I like a lot better than I did chapter 7. I feel like there's a lot less controversy in chapter 8. There's a few things that we'll talk about tonight that there's a little bit of controversy around, but most of it, most things that I teach tonight are pretty well accepted by most people. So chapter 8, in chapter 8, Daniel receives another vision. And as I told you before, there's 4 visions in these last 6 chapters of Daniel, and this is the second of those 4 visions, and we see that it happens in the 3rd year of Belshazzar's reign, which would be 2 years after the vision of chapter 7. So this would be around 550 BC, and Daniel, as we mentioned last week, would still be likely in his 70s when he gets this vision. And there's an obvious connection to chapter 7 that we see at the very beginning, because Daniel introduces this second vision as occurring after the one that he had already had, or the one that already had appeared to me, is what he says. And so, in addition, some other similarities is that both the main characters in both of these visions are animals, and just like in chapter 7, these animals represent kingdoms. And in both chapters, the main focus ends up being on this little horn. We talked about that last week in chapter 7, and then also this week as well. And we also see that in both of these chapters are visions, in chapter 7 and chapter 8, that there's conflict between the earthly kingdoms and the divine realms of the kingdom of God. In addition to some similarities, there's also some differences, though, between the two visions. Interestingly, in chapter 7, that prophecy or the events of chapter 7 was called a dream, whereas here in chapter 8, Daniel refers to it as a vision. And I'm not really sure that there's much difference in the content or form of those two, but it is kind of interesting that he calls them different things, dreams in one and visions in the other. The animals are different, right? So the animals in chapter 7 were these like bizarre, hybrid, maybe grotesque looking animals, whereas in chapter 8, these animals are pretty normal. We have a ram and a goat. And the horns may be a little bit different, but otherwise they're pretty normal animals. And probably the most important thing to me, at least in teaching, is that unlike chapter 7, in chapter 8, we're told exactly who these animals represent, which makes it a lot easier to teach when you don't have to speculate on that. And so there's really not, as I mentioned, there's not a lot of controversy except for just a few things in chapter 8, which I like. And really this chapter continues to support the overall theme of the book of Daniel, and that is that in spite of present circumstances or difficulties that you find yourself in, that God is in control, and God is going to be the one who wins in the end. So in this vision, Daniel is transported to the city of Susa, which is in the province of Elam. And Susa was actually a fortified city in Persia, or of Persia, and it was about 230 miles east of Babylon. It's where the Medes and Persians, interestingly enough, kept their winter residence. So in the winter, they would go to Susa and have a winter palace or residence. And some people speculate that the significance of Daniel being in Susa, during the reign of, remember, Belshazzar is a Babylonian king, or was the son of the Babylonian king. And so the significance here is that Daniel's being transported to a place that's going to be pretty significant soon, because the Persians are going to be the ones that are going to be next in line to sort of be the kingdom in charge. We also know that Susa is where the Persian king Xerxes, his palace was actually discovered in Susa during the 1880s. And if you remember, Xerxes was important in the book of Esther, right? That was Esther became his wife, and she would live there about 75 years after the events that we're looking at here in chapter 8. And so we also see that, more specifically, that this vision of Daniel's in chapter 8 takes place beside the Ulai Canal, which was a man-made canal that passed just to the northeast of Susa. And it's kind of interesting, if you remember in the book of Ezekiel, that Ezekiel also in chapter 1 receives his vision besides a body of water. In that case, it was the Kibar River where Ezekiel was when he had his vision. And then one last thing before we read the chapter here. If you recall back in the introduction, I told you how the first 2 chapters of Daniel were written in Hebrew, and then chapter 3, or really it's chapter 2, I should say, the first chapter was in Hebrew, and I think it was maybe after the first or second verse in chapter 2, it transitions to Aramaic, and so the entire rest of Daniel that we've been looking at so far was written in Aramaic, and now in this chapter, it switches back to Hebrew. And not that that really matters to us, right? We're reading it in English, but it's really interesting that that's the way Daniel was written, and nobody, I don't really think, has come up with a good explanation as to why it goes from Hebrew to Aramaic to Hebrew, but we switch back to Hebrew in this chapter. So I'm going to go ahead and read the entire vision and the interpretation, and then we'll get into talking about it. So we'll start in chapter 8, verse 1. It says, "In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. And in my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa in the province of Elam. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns standing beside the canal. And the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as it charged toward the west and the north and the south. No animal could stand against it, and none could rescue from its power. It did as it pleased and became great. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. It came toward the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal and charged at it in great rage. I saw it attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its 2 horns. The ram was powerless to stand against it, and the goat knocked it to the ground and trampled it, and none could rescue the ram from its power. The goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off, and in its place 4 prominent horns grew up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And out of one of them came another horn, which started small, but grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. It grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw some of the starry hosts down to the earth and trampled on them. It set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. It took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and his sanctuary was thrown down. Because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it. It prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, "How long will it take for this vision to be fulfilled?" The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people. He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconstituted." While I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard a man's voice from the Ulai canal, or from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. As he came near the place where I was standing, I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. And then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, I'm going to tell you what will happen later in the time of the wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is its first king. The four horns that replace the one that was broken off represents four kingdoms that will emerge from this nation, but will not have the same power. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a fierce-looking king, a master of intrigue will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy those who are mighty, the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper, and he will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes, yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. The vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. I, Daniel, was worn out. I lay exhausted for several days. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. All right. So that sounds confusing, right? But I think after we get through this, you'll see that it makes a lot more sense. And again, the interpretation helps us out a lot here. So Daniel gets this vision, and I'm going to kind of skip around because the interpretation ties into the beginning vision. I'm going to kind of throw those things together since we know from the interpretation what these things represent. So he gets this vision, and in verse 15, it says he is trying to understand it. And in verse 16, it says, Daniel hears a man's voice. And I think, in my opinion, this appears to be an angel. Now, Tremper Longman, who I quote a lot, he believes it's actually the voice of God that's speaking here. Interestingly, there was a guy named Jerome who was a Christian theologian around 400 AD, and he's actually the one who was responsible for translating the Hebrew Bible into Latin. They called it the Vulgate, I think. So he, speaking from 400 AD, said that the Jews identified this voice as an angel, and specifically believing it was Michael, the archangel, that was talking here. Although we're not told anything about Michael, but I think it's just interesting context that the Jews in 400 AD, or during that time, was thinking that it might have been Michael. So the Hebrew text here implies that this voice seems to hover over the water. So this voice calls out, and we read that this voice, whether it's an angel or a guide, calls out to Gabriel, right? And so this is the same Gabriel we know about, one of the chief angels. Actually, his name means God's hero. It's the same Gabriel that will announce to the birth of John, right, to Zechariah. He's going to announce to Mary about Jesus. And so this is Gabriel giving Daniel the meaning of this dream. And in verse 17, as Gabriel comes close to him, it says Daniel was terrified, right, and fell prostrate before him. So fell on his face before him, and Gabriel raises him to his feet in verse 18 and tells him he's going to tell him the meaning of the vision. He says this vision concerns the time of the end in verse 17. In verse 19, he says it concerns what will happen later in the time of the wrath and concerning the appointed time of the end. And we're going to come back to that in a little bit and talk about what that means, time of the end, time of the wrath, because it sounds a lot like the end of time, right? So let's take a look at the vision and the interpretation that Gabriel gives to Daniel. So the first thing that Daniel sees here is a ram, right? And that ram has two horns. And it says the first horn to arise was surpassed by this second horn that comes up later and was longer than the first horn. And it says the ram charged toward the west and the north and the south, and he overpowered everything before him. And verse 4 said it did as it pleased, and it became great. And we're told in verse 20, right, we're told exactly who this ram is. It says that the ram represents the kings of the Medes and the Persians. And so the horn that came up first, but it's not as large, I think almost certainly represents the Median Empire. Remember last week we talked about how there was this independent Median Empire before the merger, and it was not as great as the Persian Empire. So that would make the larger horn that came up, second, represent the Persians. And so remember, they combined their empires together, right? It was King Cyrus who brought the empires together to become the Medo-Persian Empire. And since the Medo-Persian Empire was in the east of Babylon, they would come from the east, so it meant that they would conquer to the west and to the north and to the south, going as far, this Medo-Persian Empire, as far as Turkey and down even to Egypt. And remember, it was this Medo-Persian alliance that conquered the Babylon Empire in 539 BC, and they continued to be a major force in the world after this for about 200 years after that. And the Persians, the Medo-Persian Empire, was especially important to the Jews because after they conquered Babylon, the Persian kings, or specifically King Cyrus and later King Artaxerxes, they were the ones who allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild Jerusalem and the temple. And then Nehemiah went back and rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem as well. And so next we see that as Daniel was thinking about the ram, suddenly he saw a goat coming from the west. And it moves so swiftly that it's not even touching the ground. So I think that's represented when it says it's not touching the ground, that means the goat's coming fast, right? And so the goat had this prominent horn between its eyes, almost looks like a unicorn, right? And of course, I guess that's a little bit unusual to have a goat with a single horn coming out of his head. And verse 6 says that the goat came toward the ram and charged it with great rage, attacking it furiously and shattering the ram's two horns. And after taking away the ram's power to defend itself, the goat then knocked the ram to the ground and began trampling him to destruction. Verse 7 said there was none to rescue the ram from his power. And verse 8 said the goat became very great. And so in verse 21, Gabriel tells Daniel that the shaggy goat, which is a little addition. We didn't hear shaggy at the beginning of the vision. And some of your versions may say male goat or he-goat. So the he-goat or shaggy goat, we're told by Gabriel, represents the kingdom of Greece, and that the single horn stands for its first king. And so again, unlike a lot of things in the book of Daniel, especially these last 6 chapters, there is almost universal agreement that this goat represents Greece and the horn represents Alexander the Great. And so what do we know about Alexander the Great? We know that he came from the west, right? So Greece is to the west, and he came with great speed in defeating the Medo-Persian armies. Actually, his first major victory occurred at the Granicus River in 334 BC. That's in modern-day Turkey. And then after that, he went on to fight and win 2 other great battles. There was one at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, and then the final battle was the Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BC, and he defeated the great king Darius III, actually, of the Medo-Persians. And 3 years ago, maybe, I read this book. Well, I was on a plane flight, and I watched this movie about Alexander the Great, and so then I got this book about him. And this battle, this Gaugamela battle that he won, I think generals for centuries have tried to conquer, his battle tactics, and how, because his army was so vastly outnumbered by the Medo-Persian army. The Medo-Persian army even had these elephants that they brought in from India, and there was no way he was going to win it. He somehow figured out a way to create a hole in the Medo-Persian army, and he had these long-speared guys, Sarissa maybe was the name of those swords. Meanwhile, they were able to come in the center, and they got Darius to retreat and run away, and so he ended up conquering the Medo-Persian Empire. And so he went on and conquered all the way to even all the way to India, and he did it in record time, unbelievable time. But he died suddenly and early at the age of 33 in 323 BC, and he left behind two sons that were the rightful heirs, Alexander IV and also Heracles of Macedon. So verse 8 of this vision goes on to say that at the height of the goat's power, the large horn was broken off and replaced with four prominent horns. Verse 22 says that the four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represents four kingdoms that emerge from his nation but will not have the same power. So despite the fact that Alexander had these two sons, they never came to power because they were murdered. And ultimately, Alexander's great kingdom was divided up amongst his four generals. So the four horns here represent the four powerful generals, and they were called together the Diadochi, Diadochi, which means successors or those that followed. And so those four generals were Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. And really, the most important to our study of Daniel is Ptolemy, who received Egypt. I think he set up shop in Alexandria in Egypt. And then also Seleucus, who received Syria, and I believe the capital there was Antioch. And what's interesting is that when we get to chapter 11, almost the entire chapter 11 is talking about the king of the north, who's going to be Seleucus, and the king of the south, which is Ptolemy. And the prophecy of what is going to happen 400 years later or so is just incredible, and we'll talk more about that when we get to chapter 11 as well. But those two kings, the king of the south and the king of the north, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids is what the north kingdom is going to be referred to. So they fought against each other, and these battles took place primarily in the 2nd century BC. And in the middle of those battles, you had the king of the north in Syria and the king of the south in Egypt. And what's right slab in the middle of those two things? Israel, right? Palestine, Israel. And that's important. So it's interesting in this vision that after these two kings, we skip about 2 centuries of history, which again are going to be detailed more specifically in chapter 11. So now the vision here shifts its focus to this one specific horn. Verse 9 says that out of one of these horns came another horn, which started small as a little horn, but then grew in power to the south and to the east and toward the beautiful land. What's the beautiful land? Well, the beautiful land is Israel, right? Israel is what's being referred to. In fact, in Ezekiel 20, verse 5, God calls Israel a land flowing with milk and honey. You've heard that phrase before, the most beautiful of all lands. So in verse 10, talking about this horn, it says it grew until it reached the host of the heavens, and it threw down some of the starry host and trampled them. Verse 11 said it set itself up to be as great as the commander of the army of the Lord. The horn took away the daily sacrifice from the Lord, and the place of the sanctuary was thrown down. Verse 12 says, because of rebellion, the Lord's people and the daily sacrifice were given over to it, and this horn prospered in everything it did, and truth was thrown to the ground. So that's the NIV version. The Amplified version says this, says, because of the transgression of God's people, their irreverence and ungodliness, the host will be given over. The New English translation says this, the army was given over along with the daily sacrifices in the course of his single rebellion. So it hurled truth to the ground and enjoyed great success. So I think a question here would be, because these versions are kind of different sounding, whose transgression or rebellion is it? Is it God's people who are in rebellion, and that's why the little horn does what he does? Or is it the little horn's transgression? Well, I don't think we can know for sure whose transgression we're talking about here, but I think because this chapter focuses more on the atrocities of this horn against God's people, I think it's probably talking more about the rebellion of the little horn and not the rebellion of God's people. Because we're going to see in chapter 9 next week that the responsibility of the condition of the Israelites in exile in Babylon is strictly, is definitely a result of the rebellion of God's people, back when they were the divided kingdom. That's why they got exiled into Babylon, because of their rebellion. And Daniel will acknowledge that next week in his prayer. But I think in this context, I think the rebellion that's being talked about here is the little horn's rebellion, or this small horn's rebellion. And we'll talk about who he is in just a second. So in other words, I think the New English translation has it right. The army was given over along with the daily sacrifice in the course of his single rebellion, talking about the horn. So who is this horn that's causing the suffering of God's people? Well, once again, there's almost universal agreement, I would say, that this horn that grew out of the four is the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled from 175 to 164 BC. Gabriel in verse 23 goes on to describe him as a wicked, fierce-looking king. Verse 24 says he will become very strong, but not by his own power. And we know from history that Antiochus, and maybe the proper pronunciation is Antiochus, I'm not sure which one, but Antiochus flows better for me, so I'm going to say that. So we know that he started small, but then he ultimately grew powerful. And he was actually not the first in line to succeed his older brother. So his older brother was Seleucus IV, who had a son who was Demetrius I. He was the rightful heir, but through political manipulation, and look at verse 23, says he was a master of intrigue. Antiochus was deceitful and manipulative, and he managed to manipulate his way and push his nephew out of the way and gain the throne. And so verse 9 says his kingdom spread toward the south. And we know that Antiochus made inroads all the way into Egypt, fighting against the Ptolemies that we talked about being the king of the south. And again, we'll talk more about that in chapter 11. So he captured their fortified cities. And he also spread toward the east, where he captured Persia and Parthia and Armenia. But one time, when he's going to the south and he's making inroads into Egypt, the Romans didn't want to see his empire spread. And so the Romans stopped him in Egypt. And we're going to talk specifically about the events that took place there when we get to chapter 11. But the Romans stop him. And when that happens, he gets mad. And he turns back around. And so he's heading back north from Egypt to Syria. And again, what's on the way when he gets there? The beautiful land, right? Israel. Verse 9 says, it's referred to as the beautiful land. And so he turns back and he conquers Palestine. He felt that, why did he do this? Well, one of the reasons was he felt that the Jewish religion stood in the way, their practices stood in the way of his practice of Hellenization, which was, all Hellenization was trying to spread the Greek culture into these lands that they conquered. So they wanted to make sure that the Greek culture became a part of whatever land that the Greeks conquered, and he felt like the Jewish religion stood in the way of that. Plus, he was just a bad guy as well. And so he committed many atrocities against the Jews, including ordering the cessation of the daily sacrifices, which the vision talks about here. He did that in 167 BC. His ultimate act of disrespect, though, was to profane the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar to his god Zeus. And so you can imagine as a Jew, stopping the sacrifice is one thing, but if you're going to offer a sacrifice of a pig, the most unclean animal of all, in the temple, that's about as bad as it can get. So his persecution of the Jews actually even began before that. He assassinated the Jewish high priest Onias, O-N-I-S, III, in 171 BC. And this really didn't stop until his death in about 163 BC. So Antiochus set himself up against God and his chosen people. So in verse 10 it says the starry host And I think that seems to be just a symbol of God's people, Israel. Antiochus thought of himself as a representative of God, the living embodiment of the Greek god Zeus. And so it's why he gave himself the name Epiphanes, which means the bright and shining one. He considered himself Theos Epiphanes, which means the manifest God. The Jews actually gave him another name. They called him Antiochus Epimanes, which means the crazy one or madman. And so obviously they did it when he wasn't listening, but they didn't think much of him. So these actions, and there's also other rumors that I don't think it's ever been completely substantiated, that he crucified thousands of Jews, that he took a meteor and put it in the Holy of Holies as an idol to Zeus. So just a lot of bad things that he did. So these actions by Antiochus against the formal worship of God's people was more than just an offense against the people. It was an attack against heaven itself. And so I think that's why verse 25 says Antiochus took a stand against the prince of princes, which would be against God himself. So, but such arrogance can only lead to one conclusion, and that's utter defeat. And so the defeat of the small horn is actually announced simply and definitively in verse 25. It says, "Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power." And so I don't think the phrase should be taken to mean that no human agency was involved in taking Antiochus down, but instead that the ultimate power behind what was called the Maccabean revolt was God himself. And so you've probably heard about the Maccabean revolt before. It was led by a guy named Judas Maccabeus, who began the rebellion against Antiochus in 167 BC. And really, because Antiochus had diverted his attention to matters in other parts of his empire, the revolt was able to be successful. They were able to cleanse the temple and restore the worship and sacrifice of the temple, back to normal. And actually, following this, the Jews were free of any outside oppression until the Romans conquered them in 63 BC. But the important point here, I think, to point out is that it was God who gave them the victory and allowed them to be able to restore the worship and the sacrifices back to normal. Look at verse 13. It says, "Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to him, 'How long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled, the vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that causes desolation, the surrender of the sanctuary, and the trampling underfoot of the Lord's people?'" So we're not told here, but most people think, and I would agree, that this is these holy ones here that are speaking are probably angels that are talking. And their question is, how long? Right? How long are these terrible events that Antiochus is going to wreak on the Jews? How long is it going to take place? Which really reminds me of laments that we hear in Psalm, right? There's so many of those. In Psalm 6:3, "My soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord, how long?" Psalm 13, 1-2, "How long, Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" And then 35:27 of Psalm says, "How long, Lord, will you look on? Rescue me from the ravages, my precious life from these lions." If you remember in Revelation, one of the most important verses in the whole book of Revelation, Revelation 6:10, remember the saints cried out, "How long, Sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" So here they're doing the same thing. They're crying out, how long do we have to put up with what's going on? And so notice here that the conversation shifts between these two holy ones, what I think is two angels. Then the answer is addressed to Daniel in verse 14. He said to me, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." Actually, the RSV said the sanctuary will be restored to its rightful state. So talking about the temple, right, being restored back to the way it was supposed to be before Antiochus did his thing. So I told you there's not a lot of controversy in this chapter here's where some controversy lies, and that is, what does this 2,300 evenings and mornings mean? So there's two views that take it literally, and there's one view that takes it symbolically. So one of the literal views is that the evenings and mornings refer to the evening and morning sacrifices. And so there would be two sacrifices for each day, right? One in the morning and one at night. So if there was 2,300 evening and morning sacrifices, then to get the number of days, you would divide it by 2, right? And so that would leave you with 1,150 days till the sanctuary is properly restored. So that is about 3 years and a few months. And so the people who believe that that's the literal time period that they're talking about here point out that about 3 years transpired between the time that the temple was desecrated by Antiochus to the time that it was rededicated by Judas Maccabeus in about 165 or 164 BC. The second view that takes the number literally is that the 2,300 evenings and mornings refer to full days, equaling 6 years and 4 months. So the people who point out this view go back to Genesis 1. What did God say? He said, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. He says that over and over again for each day, right? So they point out that evening and morning represent one day, so it's going to be 2,300 days. And so in this case, the time would be between Antiochus' detestable treatment of the Jews, which began in 171 BC and included the assassination of the high priest Onias, to the temple rededication following the successful Maccabean revolt in 165 BC. So that's about 6 years. And then the third view is that the number, like just about all, or maybe you could say all numbers in apocalyptic literature, is symbolic. Because the problem is here, when you take the number literally, how do you determine when it starts? I gave you 2 examples here. And how do you determine when it ends? There's so many possibilities. You can kind of make things fit the way you want it to. And so those who believe that the number is symbolic don't believe that it was given so that the people in the 2nd century would be able to figure out exactly what the right amount of days would be, and then their temple would be restored. But instead, it was an assurance that God had things under control, that God is in control of their future. In addition, the number indicates that there's going to be a stopping point, right? There's going to be a specific time when God is going to take matters back into control, and this desecration of the temple is going to be over. And that really, as a reader, you should just be encouraged by the fact that you know that God is that these things are not going to go on forever. I like how Tremper Longman puts it, and he really gives this in terms of symbolic numbers, whether it's in Daniel or whether it's in Revelation. He says this, their purpose, talking about symbolic numbers, is not for date setting, but for comfort. They remind us that God knows what He is doing. God is sovereign and has set a limit on how long the present evil world will oppress us. These facts should comfort us by reminding us that God is in control of the situation. And that's the camp I'm in. I think it's a symbolic number, just like so many other symbolic numbers that we talked about, especially when we studied Revelation. All right, so then in verse 26, it says, the vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. Go back to verse 17. It says, the vision concerns the time of the end. Verse 19 says, the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. So what's that mean? What's the distant future? What's the time of the end? Well, I believe, my personal opinion, that the end here anticipates the conclusion of what the vision is talking about, not the end of time. So therefore here, the time of the end would be directly related to the question of how long that God would allow His people to be persecuted by Antiochus IV and his temple to be desecrated. And I would say there is controversy here because there is a popular view that says that that this time of the end refers to the time of the end, or a tribulation at the end, the millennial kingdom. We talked about that a little bit last week, the premillennial view. But instead, I believe that this refers to the persecution of the Jews at the hand of Antiochus. Verse 26, Daniel was told to seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. So why would he be told to seal it up? What's that mean? Well, remember that Daniel's receiving this vision in 550 BC. And the desolation that Antiochus causes to the church takes place in 168 BC. That's about 400 years later. So that's a long time after Daniel gets this vision. Here's what Edward Myers says. He says, scrolls were often sealed to prevent anyone from tampering with the document. No part of Scripture dealing with future events is ever hidden away from the saints. Daniel is being instructed to take measures to ensure that the vision's contents would be available for generations in the distant future. These events happened 400 years later, and the writer claimed to be predicting the future. This prophecy cannot be true, as Gabriel declared, unless it actually was delivered and written many years before the events took place. Jim McGuigan actually compares the sealing here, Daniel being told to seal the vision, to what John was told in the book of Revelation. Revelation 22:10 said, do not seal up the words of the prophecy of this scroll because the time is near. So John was told in Revelation not to seal it up because the time was near. The events in Revelation were going to shortly come to pass. Remember in Revelation 1:1 it said that we're talking about things that must soon take place. So in Daniel's prophecy, though, these concerns things that were in the distant future, right? And that would be the reason for sealing it up, because it's not going to happen for another 400 years. So verse 27, the emotional impact of the vision on Daniel, and maybe on you too, is intense, right? So he was worn out and exhausted for several days. He was troubled, I think, by what he sees is going to be the trouble or the suffering that God's people were going to endure by this little horn, who he doesn't know who the little horn is. He just knows something bad's coming in the future. And so the vision ends with Daniel being exhausted and confused. It says he was appalled. Other versions say astonished or upset by what he'd seen. And so despite Gabriel's interpretation of it, he still didn't quite understand, right? It says he said it was beyond understanding. And I think this is interesting because when we get to next week in chapter 9, at the beginning of that chapter, Daniel's going to claim that he understands Jeremiah's prophecy about the 70 years, because we're going to see at the beginning of chapter 9 that Daniel has been studying, and he realizes that the 70 years are over and it's time for the Jews to go back to Babylon. So he understood that prophecy. So why can't he understand the prophecy here in chapter 8? And so I think though the vision is clear in many aspects, right, the vision would really have stunned or shocked somebody living in the 6th century. You think about this, Babylon's in charge right now when he gets this vision. You know, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, they're just dots on the map, you know, and so to get this vision and to say, and to hear this proclaim that, you know, these are the countries that are going to be, you know, powerful soon. I mean, that would have been, I think, confusing and difficult to understand to him. And so even today for us, even though we're centuries after the fulfillment, we still don't understand anything. Just like the 2,300 days, I mean, I don't think anybody's entirely clear about what that represents. I think it makes me feel a little bit better if Daniel didn't understand it, right? That maybe we can show a little humility. And probably everybody in this room does, but there are people out there who don't show humility and act like they have got it 100% figured out. So next week, we're going to be in chapter 9, and we're just going to go through Daniel chapter 9, verses 1 through 19. That includes Daniel's prayer, which is an incredible prayer. So I want to spend some time on that. And then the really controversial stuff in Daniel, probably the most controversial thing in the whole book of Daniel is in the last part of chapter 9, and we'll spend a lesson talking about that.